The security checkpoint at Vienna's prestigious Musikverein concert hall was packed with elegantly dressed patrons eager for the evening's gala performance. But when guards ordered an older woman with silver-streaked hair to open her worn leather bag for inspection, something in her composed silence made them push harder. They had no idea that this routine security check would become a moment that would shake the foundations of the classical music world forever. From which city in the world are you watching this video today? If stories of hidden legacies and long-buried truths resonate with you, consider subscribing for more untold stories from the world's greatest stages, the Golden Baroque. Architecture of Vienna's Musikverein gleamed under the late afternoon sun as crowds gathered for the prestigious International Opera Gala. Security lines snaked through the marble-floored lobby, a necessary inconvenience for an event hosting diplomats, celebrities, and Europe's cultural elite. Marina Delacroix stood in line with perfect posture despite her 58 years, her silver-streaked dark hair pulled back in an elegant chignon. She wore a simple but well-tailored black dress, modest pearl earrings, and carried only a worn leather messenger bag and a small rolling suitcase. Unlike the younger, flashier attendees around her, who chatted excitedly on phones and checked their designer outfits in compact mirrors, Marina stood silently, hands folded before her, waiting with the patience of someone who had spent a lifetime in queues, backstage corridors and holding rooms. Her eyes, a striking hazel that seemed to hold decades of stories, remained fixed forward. Security officer Klaus Berger scanned the line with practiced suspicion. A man in his mid-30s with a perpetual scowl and the rigid bearing of someone who took his authority very seriously, he'd been working security at Vienna's premier cultural venues for 8 years. His gaze lingered on Marina longer than necessary. She didn't fit the typical profile of tonight's gala attendees. No expensive jewelry, no designer handbag, no air of entitled impatience. "Next," he called sharply, gesturing Marina forward with a dismissive wave. Marina approached and presented her ticket and identification card. The lamination on her ID was yellowed with age. The photo clearly taken decades earlier. "This identification is expired," Klaus said immediately, his tone accusatory rather than helpful. "The gala coordinator confirmed it would be acceptable," Marina replied, her voice soft but clear, carrying the trained projection of someone who had learned to be heard in large spaces. She reached into her bag and produced a formal letter with the Musikverein's official seal. Klaus barely glanced at it before handing it back. "Purpose of your visit tonight?" "I'm attending the gala," Marina answered simply, "as a guest or performer." Klaus pressed, his voice rising slightly. Several people in line behind Marina had begun to notice the exchange. Marina hesitated for just a moment. As both, in a way, the vague answer only heightened Klaus's suspicion. Around them, younger attendees, fashion-forward arts patrons, wealthy donors and social media influencers documenting their glamorous evening were being waved through with cursory glances at their designer bags and expensive watches. But Klaus's focus on Marina intensified. He called over his colleague, a stockier woman named Petra Hoffmann, whose expression matched Klaus's skeptical demeanor. "Secondary screening needed here. Step aside, ma'am," Petra instructed, her tone making it clear this wasn't a request. Marina complied immediately, moving to the designated area with a subtle shift in posture that almost resembled coming to attention. When she responded with an automatic "yes, ma'am," Petra's eyebrows rose slightly. "That bag," Klaus pointed to Marina's worn leather messenger bag. "Open it. Everything out on the table. May I request a private screening?" Marina asked quietly, though something in her tone suggested she already knew the answer. "No," Klaus replied flatly. "You'll open it here, or we'll do it for you." The fluorescent security lights cast harsh shadows across Marina's face as she stood before them. A small crowd of curious onlookers had begun to gather, sensing potential drama. Some held up phones, ready to capture whatever unfolded. "Is there a problem, officers?" Marina asked, her voice betraying nothing but calm inquiry. That depends on what you're hiding in that bag, Klaus replied. People who request private screenings usually have something they don't want others to see. A group of young cultural journalists who'd been fast-tracked through the VIP line stopped to watch. One woman frowned at the treatment being given to the older woman, but said nothing. The lobby's magnificent chandeliers sparkled overhead, indifferent to the tension building at the security checkpoint. Marina set her messenger bag on the cold metal table and unzipped it partway. I would genuinely prefer privacy for this, she repeated more firmly now. And I would prefer cooperation without delays, Klaus said, his voice hardening. We can do this here, or we can take you to a holding room where the questioning becomes much more thorough. Your choice. Something flickered in Marina's eyes, not fear, but a weary recognition, as if she'd faced this kind of dismissive authority before. Very well, she said at last, stepping back from the table. Please be careful with the contents. Klaus snapped on a pair of latex gloves with theatrical flair, the sound echoing through the checkpoint area and drawing even more attention. Since you're being so difficult about a simple security check, we'll handle it ourselves. The growing crowd watched as phones appeared to record what was becoming an unexpected spectacle. Marina's expression remained neutral, but her fingers unconsciously traced a small scar on her left wrist, a nervous gesture that went unnoticed by everyone except one elderly man in an expensive suit who'd just entered the lobby and stopped at the sight of the security. A confrontation. What's so precious in this old bag? That you need special treatment? Petra asked, already unzipping the main compartment fully. They began removing Marina's possessions one by one, displaying them on the cold metal table with decreasing care. A prescription bottle of throat lozenges, a carefully wrapped framed photograph that they didn't unwrap, a worn copy of a music theory textbook with handwritten notes in the margins, a folder of what appeared to be very old sheet music. Look at this, Klaus said mockingly, holding up the sheet music. Someone thinks they're a musician. He squinted at the aged paper. These look ancient. Found these in your attic, did you? Marina's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly, but she said nothing. As the officers continued their search, more personal items emerged, things that should have remained private. A letter written in faded ink, addressed to dearest Marina in elegant script. Medical documents with test results partially visible. Each item displayed for the growing audience under the harsh lights. A young woman in the crowd whispered to her companion, "This feels wrong. They're humiliating her." "Can't look away, though," her friend replied, phone still recording. Klaus pulled out a small leather journal, its cover worn smooth by years of handling. He flipped it open, reading aloud with exaggerated curiosity. Vocal exercises, breathing techniques, performance notes from... He squinted at the date. 1989? What is this? Your diary from when you dreamed of being an opera singer. Marina's silence seemed to irritate him further. These old people and their delusions, he said loudly enough for everyone nearby to hear, always living in fantasies of who they wish they'd been. That journal is personal, Marina said quietly, her voice steady, but with an undertone of steel. Please handle it with respect. Oh, it's personal, Klaus mocked. Then maybe you should have requested that private screening you kept asking for. He tossed the journal back onto the table carelessly. It landed with a slap that made Marina flinch slightly, the first real reaction she'd shown. Petra had moved to a smaller inner pocket of the bag. What's this? She pulled out a small velvet pouch. Opening it without asking permission, she dumped its contents onto the table. Several pins and small medals clattered against the metal surface. Klaus picked one up, examining it. Looks like costume jewelry, or maybe props from a play. Those are conservatory awards, Marina said, her voice barely above a whisper. Please be careful with them. Awards? Petra laughed. From where? Community theater. She held one up to the light. I don't recognize any of these. They look homemade. An older man in the crowd, a distinguished-looking gentleman with sharp eyes and a military bearing, had moved closer, his attention caught by the medals on the table. His expression shifted from casual curiosity to focused interest. There's more in here, Klaus announced, reaching into the final compartment of the bag. Let's see what other treasures our aspiring diva is hiding. He pulled out a carefully folded piece of fabric. As he shook it open with deliberate carelessness, several people in the growing crowd gasped audibly. It was unmistakably a formal concert gown, deep sapphire blue silk with intricate beading along the bodice. Despite being folded in a bag, the quality of the garment was evident even to untrained eyes. Playing dress-up, are we? Klaus asked with a smirk, holding the gown up like a matador taunting a bull. Were you planning to sneak into the backstage area? Pretend you're one of the performers? Marina's eyes never left the gown as it hung from Klaus's careless grip. For the first time, real emotion flickered across her features, not anger, but profound sadness mixed with something that might have been dignity under assault. That gown has historical significance, she said quietly. It was made by historical significance, Klaus interrupted with exaggerated disbelief. Right, and I suppose you wore it to perform for the Emperor of Austria? His sarcasm drew uncomfortable laughter from some in the crowd, while others had grown silent, no longer finding entertainment in the spectacle. Petra had been examining the tags and labels inside the gown more carefully. This is from Maison Laval, she said, referring to one of Vienna's most prestigious couture houses. But that doesn't make sense. This style is from decades ago. The stitching alone, probably a knockoff from a costume shop, Klaus dismissed, though uncertainty had crept into his voice. He turned the gown around, displaying it to the gathered crowd. Ladies and gentlemen, we have a vintage costume enthusiast trying to crash tonight's gala, but something had changed in the atmosphere. The distinguished older man, who'd been watching intently, had pulled out his phone and was making a call, his expression grave. Several other people in the crowd had noticed the quality of the items being displayed and were beginning to question the officer's mockery. There's a name embroidered inside, a woman in the crowd said suddenly, pointing. Right there in the lining, Klaus found the small embroidered script and read it aloud. Monsieur Delacroix. He looked up at Marina. So this is supposedly yours? You had this made for you? It was made for me, yes, Marina confirmed simply, when last week at a costume rental place. Klaus pressed. In 1986, Marina replied. For my debut performance at this very hall, the lobby had grown noticeably quieter. Klaus and Petra exchanged glances, less certain now but unwilling to back down. You're claiming you performed at the Musikverein? Petra asked skeptically. In 1986? You would have been 22 years old, Marina said. It was December 14th. I sang Mozart's Laudate Dominum with the Vienna Philharmonic. Maestro Karajan conducting. Several people in the crowd shifted uncomfortably. The name Karajan, legendary conductor of the Vienna Philharmonic, carried weight even decades after his death. Marina was claiming a connection to one of the 20th century's most important musical figures. Right, Klaus said, his skepticism intact. And I suppose you have proof of this fantasy? The program is in my bag, Marina replied. In the folder with the sheet music you were examining, Petra grabbed the folder and pulled out an aged, yellowed program from the Musikverein's 1986 season. She opened it carefully. The paper was fragile with age. Her expression changed as she read. There is a performance listed here, she admitted slowly. December 14th, 1986. Mozart's Vesperae Solennes de Confessore. And there's a name. She squinted at the small print listing the soloists. Marina Delacroix, soprano, the crowd murmured. Klaus grabbed the program from Petra's hands, examining it closely, as if looking for signs of forgery. Programs can be faked, he said, but his voice had lost its confident mockery. This could be a reproduction, a souvenir. It doesn't prove anything. Check the photographs, Marina suggested quietly. In the frame, I asked you to be careful with. Klaus had already moved to the wrapped frame, tearing away the protective cloth with less care than Marina had clearly used to wrap it. The photograph inside was a formal portrait, black and white, professional quality, clearly taken decades ago. It showed a young woman in her early 20s, radiantly beautiful, wearing the exact sapphire gown that lay on the table. She stood on what was unmistakably the Musikverein's main stage. the famous golden organ pipes visible in the background. Next to her stood an older man whose face would be recognized by anyone with even passing knowledge of classical music. Herbert von Karajan himself. The silence in the lobby was now complete. Klaus stared at the photograph, his face draining of color as he looked from the young woman in the image to Marina standing before him. The resemblance was unmistakable, the same bone structure, the same distinctive hazel eyes, the same elegant bearing. This could still be fake, Klaus stammered, but even he didn't sound convinced anymore. "Check the back of the photograph," Marina said, her voice still calm, but now with an undertone of vindication. "There's an inscription." Petra carefully removed the photo from its frame and turned it over. In faded ink, written in German in an elegant hand, were the words, "To Marina, whose voice gives heaven new meaning. With admiration and gratitude, H.V. Karajan. December 1986. A woman in the crowd who'd been watching the entire exchange stepped forward. An elegant older lady with the bearing of someone accustomed to art circles. "My God," she said, loud enough to be heard. "Marina Delacroix. I remember now. You were called Die Nachtigall, the Nightingale of Vienna. You performed at the Staatsoper, La Scala, the Metropolitan Opera. You were everywhere in the late 80s and early 90s, and then I disappeared," Marina finished quietly. In 1994, the distinguished man who'd been making phone calls earlier pushed his way through the crowd. He was tall, impeccably dressed, with the commanding presence of someone used to authority. "Officers," he said, his voice carrying unmistakable weight, "I strongly suggest you stop this screening immediately." Klaus turned to face him, defensive now. "Sir, this is a security matter. We're following protocol. I am Dr. Friedrich Steiner," the man interrupted, "director of the Musikverein's historical archives. And what you're doing is humiliating one of the most important voices in this institution's recent history." The crowd pressed closer, fascinated by the unfolding drama. Petra was now examining other items from Marina's bag with newfound care. The medals, the journal, the sheet music, seeing them with different eyes. "These awards," Dr. Steiner continued, picking up one of the small pins from the table, "are from the International Vocal Competition in Geneva. This one specifically is given only to first-place winners. I have another just like it in our archive upstairs. Donated by Miss Delacroix in 1992, along with other memorabilia from her career." Klaus and Petra stood frozen, the full weight of their error beginning to dawn on them. Around them, phones were capturing every moment, every word. What had started as a routine security check had become a public exposure of their disrespect towards someone who clearly deserved better treatment. "I don't understand," a young woman in the crowd called out. "If she was so famous, why did she disappear? Why is she here now like this, as a regular guest?" Marina turned to face the crowd, and for the first time, something in her guarded expression softened slightly. "I disappeared because my voice did," she said simply. "In 1994, I developed a condition called spasmodic dysphonia. My vocal cords would spasm involuntarily. One day I could sing Mozart and Puccini. The next I could barely speak clearly. The lobby had grown so quiet that Marina's soft voice carried easily to every listener. The medical treatments available then were limited," she continued. "I tried everything, therapy, surgery, experimental medications. Nothing worked. My career ended overnight. I went from performing on the world's greatest stages to barely being able to order coffee without my voice failing." "Why didn't anyone know?" Dr. Steiner asked gently. "Why didn't you reach out to the musical community? There are foundations, support systems." "Pride," Marina admitted. "And shame. I had been praised as the voice of a generation. I couldn't bear to be seen as broken, as a failure. I left Vienna and essentially disappeared from the musical world. I've spent the last 30 years working as a music archivist in Salzburg, cataloguing the work of others because I couldn't create my own anymore." Petra's hand had moved to her mouth, horror at their treatment of Marina now fully apparent. Klaus stood rigid, still holding the sapphire gown, unable to meet Marina's eyes. Then why are you here tonight? Someone in the crowd asked. Why come back now? Before Marina could answer, the main entrance doors of the Musikverein opened with dramatic timing. A small group entered, clearly official, clearly important. At the front walked a woman in her 70s, elegant and authoritative, flanked by several younger people carrying folders and what appeared to be audio-visual equipment. The crowd parted instinctively. Dr. Steiner straightened, recognition and respect evident in his posture. "Madam Director," he said, nodding formally. The woman, Director General Sophia Hartmann, the Musikverein's highest authority, approached the security checkpoint with purposeful strides. Her eyes moved from the items scattered on the table to Marina, standing quietly amid the chaos. To the two security officers, whose faces now showed complete panic, "Miss Delacroix," Director Hartmann said, her voice carrying the weight of genuine respect. "I apologize profusely for this treatment. We've been waiting for you in the VIP reception area. When you didn't arrive, I came to investigate." She turned to face Klaus and Petra, her expression icy. "Would someone care to explain why tonight's guest of honor has been detained and publicly humiliated at a security checkpoint?" Guest of honor. The words rippled through the crowd like an electric current. Klaus's face had gone from pale to ashen. We had no way of knowing, Madam Director." She didn't identify herself. Her credentials seemed questionable. "She presented the invitation we sent her." Director Hartmann cut him off sharply. "An invitation to return to the Musikverein after 30 years for a very specific purpose." One of the younger staff members stepped forward, opening a folder. "Ma'am, should we proceed with the presentation here or wait until—" "Here," Marina said quietly but firmly. "If my story is going to be told, it should be told to everyone, not just to the privileged few in a private reception room." Director Hartmann nodded, understanding and approving of Marina's decision. She gestured to her staff, who quickly set up a small portable screen and projector, remarkably high-tech equipment appearing with swift efficiency in the Baroque lobby. "Ladies and gentlemen," Director Hartmann addressed the crowd, which had now grown to include most of the early arrivals for the gala. "We had planned to announce this during tonight's performance, but circumstances have changed those plans. 3 months ago, we launched an initiative to locate and honor former performers whose careers were cut short by circumstances beyond their control. Marina Delacroix was at the top of that list. The screen flickered to life, showing photographs from Marina's career, stunning images of a young woman in her prime, performing on the world's greatest stages, reviewing glowing reviews in multiple languages. Video footage began to play. Marina at 25, singing at La Scala, her voice soaring through the Italian opera house with technical perfection and emotional depth. The crowd watched, transfixed. Many were too young to remember Marina's brief but brilliant career, but the evidence of her extraordinary talent was undeniable. Marina Delacroix performed professionally for only 12 years, Director Hartmann continued. But in that time, she was considered by critics to be one of the finest lyric sopranos of the late 20th century. Maestro Karajan called her the voice I had been waiting my entire career to conduct. Leonard Bernstein wrote her a personal letter saying her Mozart interpretations had moved him to tears. More images appeared on the screen, letters from legendary conductors and composers, reviews from the world's most prestigious newspapers, photographs with musical luminaries who were now themselves legends. And then, in 1994, she vanished from the musical world, Director Hartmann said, her voice softening. "We didn't know why. Some speculated she'd retired to start a family. Others suggested scandal or personal tragedy. The truth, which Miss Delacroix has now shared with us, is that a medical condition robbed her of the instrument that defined her, life. The video footage showed Marina performing Puccini's O mio babbino caro, the same aria from Gianni, Schicchi that had been one of her signature pieces. Her voice in the recording was pure, crystalline, heartbreaking in its beauty. Several people in the crowd had tears in their eyes. Klaus and Petra stood to the side, forgotten now, witnessing the magnitude of their error. The items they'd so carelessly examined lay on the security table like sacred relics, which in the world of classical music they essentially were. 6 months ago, Director Hartman continued, medical advances in treating spasmodic dysphonia reached a point where Miss Delacroix's doctors suggested she try a new treatment protocol. After 30 years of silence, there was hope. Marina stood very still, her eyes on the screen, watching her younger self, the woman she used to be when her voice had been her power, her identity, her gift to the world. The treatment worked, Director Hartman said, and emotion entered her voice for the first time. Not completely. Marina's voice will never be what it was at its peak, but it has returned enough for her to sing again. And tonight, in the same hall where Herbert von Karajan introduced her to the world 38 years ago, Marina Delacroix will perform once more. The lobby erupted in gasps and murmurs. Marina's eyes widened slightly. This was clearly new information to her. "You said I was a guest," Marina said to Director Hartman. "You never mentioned performing. I said you were the guest of honor," Director Hartman replied with a gentle smile. "And for a soprano, honoring her means giving her back her stage. If you're willing." Marina looked down at the sapphire gown on the security table, then at the photograph of her younger self, then at the crowd of strangers who'd witnessed her humiliation and were now seeing her vindication. "I haven't performed in public in 3 decades, she said softly. "My voice isn't what it was. I'll crack on the high notes. I'll have limited range. Everyone will hear what I've lost. Or," Dr. Steiner said quietly, "they'll hear what you've found again. Not perfection, but courage. Not youth, but wisdom. Not the voice of a rising star, but the voice of someone who never stopped being a musician even when she couldn't sing." Marina's hand moved unconsciously to her throat, a gesture she'd probably made thousands of times over the 30 years of silence, checking, hoping, mourning the loss. Then she looked at Klaus and Petra, who stood in mortified silence, and something shifted in her expression. Not anger, not vindictiveness, but a kind of clarity. "Your treatment of me tonight," she said to them, her voice steady, "was unkind. But it was also a reminder of something important. When I was young and successful, doors opened before I reached them. People remembered my name. I was recognized and honored wherever I went. And then, when my voice failed, all of that disappeared. I became invisible." She picked up the sapphire gown from the table, holding it with care. "Tonight, I learned that I'm visible again, not because of who I was, but because of what I represent. Everyone who's lost something precious and thought they could never get it back. Everyone who's been dismissed or forgotten. Everyone who's had to rebuild themselves from nothing." Marina turned to Director Hartman. "I'll perform tonight. Not the aria from my youth, I'm not that person anymore. But I'd like to sing Schubert's Ave Maria. It was my mother's favorite. She never got to hear me perform professionally. She died 2 months before my debut. It will be perfect," Director Hartman said, tears visible in her eyes now. As Marina was escorted away by staff to prepare, the security checkpoint slowly returned to its normal function. But Klaus and Petra remained standing by their table, surrounded by the evidence of who Marina Delacroix really was, and their failure to see beyond surface assumptions. "We need to resign," Petra said quietly. "After this, after what we did." "No," came a voice. They turned to see Dr. Steiner had remained behind. "You need to learn. Miss Delacroix could have you fired with a word. She could sue this institution for how you treated her. But she won't. Do you know why?" Both officers shook their heads, unable to speak. "Because she understands that everyone deserves grace," Dr. Steiner said. "Even people who don't show grace to others. Your job going forward is to remember this moment every single time you interact with someone at this checkpoint. Every person who comes through has a story. Treat them accordingly." 3 hours later, the Musikverein's main hall was filled to capacity. The gala had been restructured to feature Marina's return as its centerpiece. The golden hall glowed with the light from crystal chandeliers, and the audience included many who'd witnessed the scene at the security checkpoint, eager to be part of what they now recognized as a historic moment. Marina stood backstage in her sapphire gown. It still fit perfectly, though 30 years had changed her body in subtle ways. Her silver-streaked hair was styled elegantly, and she wore no jewelry except the small pins from her conservatory days, the ones Klaus had dismissed as costume jewelry, pinned to her dress like badges of honor. Her hands shook slightly as she waited for her cue. It had been 10,957 days since she'd last stood on a professional stage. 10,957 days of silence, of loss, of mourning the gift that had been taken from her. The introduction began. Schubert's Ave Maria was a piece that required both technical control and deep emotional resonance. Marina closed her eyes, said a silent prayer to her mother, and walked onto the stage. The audience's applause was immediate and thunderous. Many had seen the video footage from earlier. They knew what this moment meant. Marina waited for silence, then nodded to the pianist. The introduction began, simple, elegant, sacred. And then she sang. Her voice emerged with a quality that was immediately apparent. This was not the pure, flawless instrument of her youth. There was a slight rasp to it, a fragility that came from years of damage and difficult recovery. On the higher notes, there was an audible effort, a vulnerability. But there was also something new, a depth of emotion that her younger voice, for all its technical perfection, had never quite achieved. Every note carried the weight of loss and recovery, silence and sound, despair and hope. She sang not as the prodigy who had conquered stages at 22, but as a woman who had lost everything and fought her way back to something that resembled wholeness. By the time she reached the final verse, there was not a dry eye in the audience. The imperfections in her voice, the slight waver, the careful navigation of passages that once would have been effortless, only made the performance more powerful. This was not a demonstration of flawless technique. It was a testimony to survival. The final note faded into silence. For a long moment, the audience sat motionless, as if afraid to break the spell. Then the applause began, first scattered, then building to a standing ovation that lasted nearly 10 minutes. Marina stood on the stage, where her career had begun 38 years earlier. Tears streaming down her face, no longer the invisible woman who'd been humiliated at a security checkpoint, but finally, after decades of silence, visible again. In the back of the hall, Klaus and Petra stood against the wall. They'd been given permission to watch from a service entrance. They saw what their assumptions had nearly prevented. The return of a voice that the world had lost, imperfect but irreplaceable. Speaking to the truth that grace is not about perfection, but about the courage to be seen as we really are. And Marina Delacroix, whose voice had once been called perfect and was now called courageous, finally understood that she had never lost the thing that made her an artist. It had just been waiting, through 3 decades of silence, for the right moment to be heard again.